Saskatchewan mental health training and support teams, and it's just a real privilege to be able to talk today with you, and thanks for giving your time to us today. We look forward to hearing from you along the way. How's this going to go today? First of all, you see over here we have several topics. We're going to talk about the impact of suicide, then how to talk about suicide. Then we're going to talk about a plan. What are the actual steps you take to go through when you're interacting with somebody who might have suicidal ideation or an imminent threat of suicide? We need to talk about why people die by suicide. And then there's some warning signs and risk factors. There's a difference between the two of them. So we'll go over those. And a lot of times, Ange, you'll know people kind of mix those one over the other, but those combine together to give us a big picture if there's a higher risk. Then we're going to talk about the resources. Just briefly, we'll show you some of those. And today we don't want to leave you without hope, because we want to go through a little bit of what hope means to us when we're interacting with somebody who's suicide and how we can support somebody, giving them hope. Let's talk about the impact of suicide for just a little bit. You may or may not be a fan of statistics, but the facts are suicide is a global issue and has been for such an enduring time. Globally, there's 800,000 suicide deaths per year. That's the average, and it seems to be going up every year. That means one death every 40 seconds globally. If we start to distill it down and look how close it is to home, it is. Many of us, in fact, if we were to ask the polling question, how many of you have been impacted by suicide? We definitely hear from a lot of you that someone really close to you has taken their own life. In fact,
well, for every suicide death, there are 5 self-inflicted injury hospitalizations and 25 to 30 attempts. So that doesn't mean that person, it means for every suicide, there are other people attempting suicide. And 7 to 10 people they say is affected by suicide loss, but we know that it can impact hundreds of people, especially if that person was well known, or if that person worked with the person as well, or if we know that it's more than 7 to 10 people.
Yeah, that pool of who knows whom goes fairly deep, and when a person has a lot of social connections and contacts in the real world and in the cyber world, that 7 to 10 people who are impacted can trickle down to be quite a large number more. Looking at North America, coming even a little closer to home here, if you're watching us today from somewhere outside North America, it's great to have you here as well. But we're going to kind of focus a bit on what's going on here for us in the places we know best. In Canada, we have over 4,600 suicides annually. And the United States, it's about 10 times what Canada is, being about 10 times the population. Mm-hmm. Mexico is a little bit higher than Canadian suicide rate per year. And we'll talk a bit about the difference between men and women shortly, but let's give you a snapshot of the most recent data we have, aggregate data from 2005 to 2019, right here in our province, Saskatchewan, from the Saskatchewan Coroner's Service. So that's a large graph with a lot of numbers, and I don't think everybody needs to read those. So let's take a peek at these 5 years. What's that, starting 2019 on the right?
Yeah.
18, 17, 16, 15.
So obviously in 2018, it hit a peak, and we want to make sure that we really emphasize those are the ones that can be tracked. So tracked suicides are where there is something very tangible that's left behind. Either it's a note, or we know that ligature is something that is claimed as suicide. We know that certain suicides are very obvious and others are not so obvious, and so they don't get tracked the same. What we do know in 2019 so far is that there was a lot more mental health training in Saskatchewan. So knowing that there's a lot more mental health training in Saskatchewan, we are now collectively as a nation a little bit more trained than we were before. Ontario and Quebec were first trained. Alberta was along with them, and Saskatchewan has been the last to get really robust mental health training in our province. So
that's really a picture of hope. Then if that number is real, that 2019 number being almost half of the 2018 number, if suicide deaths are going down, all the data is not in. There may be a number came in that are decided they're suicides, but it really seems like that could indicate things are starting to improve. People are talking about mental health and suicide more openly.
It could be, and it is a good sign. At the same time, we know that it does impact people far greater than it ever did before, because there's just so much of it, especially in our youth, who are at the highest risk than adults currently.
That's so true. And the complexities that are in front of us with the present COVID-19 crisis globally, that's going to change things, as we'll talk about in a little bit. So looking forward from there, we know this, that once there's mental health issues, the increase for death by suicide goes up. 70 to 90% of suicides are due to mental health problems. And we know this as well, that if there's enduring personal, relational, financial, or social stressors, the risk only increases.
So if somebody has been living with a mental illness, or they've been living with someone who lives with a mental illness, all of these stressors now are cumulative for everyone. And that will also increase our risk simply by the fact that we have lost more during this crisis by this pandemic. Everyone has had some sort of loss, and some people have been greatly impacted by loss, whether it's their business, whether it's their family, whether it's they couldn't see their family. Things like that impact people differently. And so if you've been living with a mental illness, just know that you will be more impacted by those stressors. And we want to give you some hope at the end of this. And just showing what our brains does in isolation will come soon.
And we originally had this presentation titled The Suicide Risk Increase from COVID-19. It's about the risk that we're talking about, but now we're titling it Talking About Suicide from COVID-19, and people will have that more pronounced risk when they have all these new things to worry about and be anxious about in the future. But we're going to cut to what really is the gold mine right away here. Over here, we're going to talk about how to talk about suicide. It's often been the case where people won't talk about suicide with someone they care about for various reasons. Why, Ange, is it so hard to talk about suicide?
It just never has been done. In any era, any generation, it's never been a topic that people want to talk about or that people have been able to talk about. If there was some past suicides in a family, it usually was a little bit masked by, well, they died and that was it, or something like that. But it wasn't talked about because it was taboo. We thought certain things. If we talk about it, then we'll give people the idea. Is it a brand new idea? It never has been. Since humans have been inhabiting planet Earth, it has never been a new idea. So just know that if you are talking about suicide with your loved ones, with trusted persons, it's not a new idea. It's just something that's proliferated over time.
But we've often been told we can't talk about suicide because we're not therapists or counselors. And that is true. Maybe we're not therapists or counselors, but here's the reality. If I have a heart condition, or I have a hip surgery, or I have a prostate issue, you can ask me about those things because I'm human. And if we took a poll right now and asked how many of you were born, human babies, pretty much all of you would say you were. And you were given one of these beautiful things when you came out of the mama's womb. This is one from Saskatchewan. Yet to have a name placed in it, as you see, but that means you were a human baby and you have a certificate to talk to humans. If you have that birth certificate, just know when you want to engage in meaningful conversation with another human being, you're allowed to do it. You don't need special credentials to be a therapist or counselor. It's a gap that needs to be filled. And we can do it as humans can do it.
Yeah, and we do need to equalize it. Everyone asks that if they have a godfather, if they have a father who's had a heart attack, they ask them how they're doing, how their exercise program's going, or how their supports are, or what kind of medication. Mm-hmm. We've long been asking people, how are you doing? What are you doing about your physical health? We need to start having those conversations about our mental health.
And just to go a little further than that, when people ask people about physical health, the recipient of your support feels better. They just feel better by being asked and cared for. This will be the exact same thing when we ask people about their mental health or if they're considering suicide. Mm-hmm. So congratulations on the certificate. You're a human. Please use your power as a human to talk to humans about human things whenever you can. So we'll talk about some of the hard questions here in the language of suicide in just a moment. But we know when somebody kills himself, we often use terms that aren't as dignifying.
No, we use terms that are related to sin or related to crime, instead of saying that person attempted suicide, therefore they lived, or that person died by suicide and therefore they died. We're talking about the language of suicide, and one of the reasons why we don't talk about it is stigma. And stigma is just simply the negative attitudes that lead us to negative behaviors. If we don't have communication or conversations about suicide, we will get caught up in using language that harms people or indicts people or makes people feel like because they're thinking of suicide, because they're in distress or so much distress that is their solution. So we want to destigmatize the conversations around suicide so that we can have productive conversations. So making sure that we don't label people, making sure that we don't stereotype, making sure that we don't create a division because of those labels and stereotypes. Those are really important in order for us to not discriminate against people for thinking about suicide or for having suicidal ideation or for dying by suicide.
And you see those terms there up on the top line: successful suicide attempt, failed suicide attempt, completed suicide. You know, we don't like to connect suicides with successes or failures. In fact, projects are the things that should be successful or failed, relationships even so much so, but now we're talking about life and death things such as suicide. So the terms we use are clearly died by suicide or attempted suicide. That's all we need to use. In fact, if you've ever asked someone this question, it's hard. The words coming out of your mouth don't feel very good. And the two ways we ask a question when we're thinking of somebody and we get an encounter with them or interact with them when suicidal ideation is real is, hey, Jim, are you thinking of killing yourself? Or the other way to ask it.
Or is to say, hey, Jim, are you thinking of suicide? Just simply asking the question invites that person to say yes or no. That's usually what we've avoided in the past, but we want yes or no. Yes means we are invited into their world because we get to ask more questions. No means we have to accept that. And if they ever need our support in the future, we need to be there for them.
Because like Angellah said, asking those questions doesn't get somebody to consider suicide. It's never the case that if she were to say to me, Jim, are you thinking of killing yourself? I'd say, oh, good idea. I hadn't thought about that, Ange. That doesn't happen. Research displays when you ask somebody the direct questions, it moves them farther away from suicidal risk and suicidal ideation.
So how do we ask these questions? It's really important about how we ask those questions and further questions if they're having that conversation with us. So we need to know what acceptance is. What is acceptance? Acceptance means putting my beliefs, my thoughts, my criticisms, anything I hold that I may think, well, do I really accept this person? And fully accept what they're saying is true for them and what is happening is real for them.
The next thing we need to do is be genuine. You see it there on your screen. Genuineness is a hard thing to fake. And a person who's in distress because of their mental health and having suicidal ideation, if you're not genuine, they almost have a sixth sense to realize, hey, this guy's not genuine, this gal's not genuine. And so they don't take your support and care. Genuine means the things you say and do, your posture, your body language, your tone, your neurolinguistics, all the way that things come out of your mouth really are meaningful and genuine. And it's important that we get there. Next, we have
empathy, and empathy is really comprised of 4 components. So Brené Brown describes it best, and empathy is the components of literally starting with taking their perspective.
How do we do that?
Well, we listen to them and we take what they're saying is real. Then staying out of judgment. Really hard for human beings. Judgment we save for reality TV shows or, whether we like this or that ice cream. If we can say, okay, this is where judgment doesn't belong, because it does belong some places, but this isn't where it belongs.
Yeah, so we start out with acceptance, genuineness, and empathy has 2 of 4 components we've talked about. Taking someone's perspective, staying out of judgment, and the last 2 are so important if we're going to be genuine. It's recognizing an emotion, and that's easy. We often see, oh, you're angry, oh, you're happy. We see, oh, you're sad, oh, you're distressed. But do we then do the 4th step of empathy, which is communicate that?
Mm-hmm. And sometimes we might be wrong. Maybe we're reading people wrong. Just taking a step back and saying, it looks like you're you're not your usual self. Is that true? Is that accurate? Am I seeing things wrong? Just allowing ourselves to be wrong is really part of the big conversation that we need to have with each other.
Such a hard thing. This is one of the reasons why we asked earlier why we don't talk about suicide, because we're worried about being wrong. What is the risk, Ange, if you come to me and say, Jim, have you been thinking of killing yourself? And you're wrong. What's the risk?
Well, the risk is you might get offended and we might have an argument, or you might get defensive thinking, oh, do you think I'm stupid? I wouldn't do that. That sometimes happens. That's the risk we take. But then conveying that to the person in not a defensive way, but saying, hey, I'm sorry, I read that wrong. I just care about you. And I really, really just want to know that you're okay.
That's like pulling out your membership card and saying, hey, I'm a human baby at one point. I have my certificate. I can apologize and back up. And it works for most people most time when we're genuine.
Mm-hmm.
So what do we do for suicide intervention? What are those 3 steps that we need to know?
Well, we need to ask yes or no is what we're looking for, right? We need to ask if they have a plan. Plans tell us a lot. So asking about a plan and saying, so how are you thinking of dying? That's hard to do, because then that person has to vocalize to us. They actually have to share their sacred pain with us and keep that sacred. So you as a listener on that other end, trying not to convey emotions that would alarm them or would put them off from conversing with us, making sure that we know what their plan is so that we can actually intervene.
So when your gut check is saying, hey, maybe Jim's thinking of killing himself, asking, are you thinking of killing yourself? And then that next step, what is that plan? Ask about that plan. There's a few more things connected to wanting to know about that plan as well. And the plan itself is, it's different for everybody, but you have a job to do once you've been invited into that conversation. Because you're an accepting, genuine, and empathetic person, or empathic, those 2 words mean the same thing. Your job is to check into that plan. What is the plan about? And some of the things we find in the suicidal person's plan is they might have issues that are affecting their immediate safety. Are they intending to attempt suicide right away? Direct questions are important. Have you decided when you're going to carry it out, as Ange said? Whether they've already taken steps. What steps have you taken, Jim, to kill yourself? This is so important that we talk about this. And whether they, oh, go ahead.
And whether they actually have secured those means. So this really just creates for us, is this immediate? Do I need to call 911 right away? Are they talking in terms of if things don't get better in a month? So you have a little bit of time to actually have those conversations and continue them. Or are they thinking, I don't know, those things are uncertainty for us. If at all we are uncertain whether or not someone's plan is immediate or long-term or short-term, or whether circumstances are incumbent in their plan, we need to actually say, hey, if this is too much for me, I'm going to call 911 and ask the officers or the police who do have mental health training, what should I do? My friend is thinking about suicide and I can't reach them. That's the most important, because we know of all the police officers that we've ever encountered and are friends of ours, they would much rather go and save a life than go and tell somebody that somebody's life is done.
So you've done that. You're being very brave. And I know it's not easy to talk about suicide with somebody, but taking that step, letting those words come into your mouth. Jim, are you thinking of suicide? Are you planning to kill yourself? Finding out what the plan is, because I've said yes and you're invited into my world. And then the next step, Ange, is this safety plan to offer help and support. This might be part of phoning the police to get support from them as well. But the safety plan itself has some unique characteristics that we can just talk about for a moment.
So an agreement between you and this person who is thinking about suicide, actions on to keep the person safe. Before COVID-19, we would be actually asking, hey, I want to come over, I want to chat with you, but focusing on what they should do. That person is reaching out by actually saying yes. That person wants your support or someone's support that can be trusted. And so really take that to heart. Be clear, outline what will be done, who will do it, and when. An easy length of time to cope with, or what to bring to bring a sense of achievement. can you please make an agreement or a contract with me that you won't do this until I can talk to you 6 meters apart and get to you as soon as possible, or the police or mobile crisis or someone you trust, including contact numbers of doctors, of course, and suicide hotlines. Family, ask about past supports. Where did those go? What helped you before? If you have thought about it in the past, asking how they'd like to be supported. How can I support you in the best way that's going to keep both of us safe, and especially you right now? Ask if you can be a support in any way, but don't take on their responsibilities. We know that we can't do that in COVID-19 right now. So asking what would mean anything to you right now. And if it's simple and you can do it, that's what you can do. If it's not simple, if it's not something you can do, ask where can we go to find those resources that can assist you right now.
So you're sharing responsibility with them in some sense. And this is an interesting part of this point number 3, which we saw, focus on what they should do. Just elaborate a minute. This one often causes people to stumble up because we're so inclined as humans to say, Jim, no, I'm not going to let you go to your garage and get a rope. I'm not going to let you go home alone. You're telling me what not to do. And that's pretty instinctual for some of us because we don't want somebody to kill themselves, which is great. But to focus on what Jim should do. Jim, what I need you to do is come with me, and we're going to the garage and we're going to gather that rope together so that you can't hurt yourself with it or kill yourself. So that's something to do. Jim, we're going to go sit down with our phones and Google some support or resources that might be able to help us both in this, because this is a horrible thing you've told me, and I'm here to walk through it with you. That's how that needs to go.
Or simply, Jim, friend, loved one, we can do this together. Let's team up and find the right resource for you. There's got to be someone who can help both of us talk this through. That's also a resource. Knowing that they're part of a team, knowing that they're not alone, knowing that someone cares enough to go through those steps with them.
So suicide prevention can be asking the direct question, finding out what the plan is, and then devising a safety plan. And it's going to be custom. And it's also good at times to not go through this alone. One last point about that, Ange. Is it okay to recruit somebody else who's got some care and concern?
You know, I would ask the person, can I call somebody that I trust deeply and perhaps you might trust too? Because you shouldn't tackle this alone, neither should I. I'm not your complete resource, but I want you to get all the support you can. So asking them if you can call a trusted friend or a trusted person or a mental health professional or a mental health first aider. Anyone who has any training is equipped to go through these ask, plan, and safety measures.
It's pretty simple when we commit to doing it.
Okay, let's continue. And we're going to talk about why people die by suicide now. There are some really good research on why people die by suicide. Now, we know that people who have physical disabilities also have mental health challenges that come with it, especially if it's been long-term. So don't just equate both physical and mental as separate from each other. We're whole people. Those things are combined. So knowing why people die by suicide, we know who's at risk the most. So Thomas Joyner.
Thomas Joyner brings an excellent theme or strategy. Actually, it's a theory, basically, of why people die by suicide. He wrote several books on it, does some excellent work, web-based work, personal work, and he realizes that people have interconnected circles of risk or concern. If I feel like I'm a burden to my wife, my kids, my family, my workplace, I have a perceived sense of burdensomeness. He says there's another circle that has to interconnect with it. My sense of belonging might be thwarted.
Sense of belonging is so important to our identity, to our sense of why we want to live. If I belong to a family that loves me, accepts me, they're genuine and they're supportive, I will have more resiliency. I won't think of suicide as readily as people who do not feel like they belong. Oftentimes people with disabilities, whether they be mental or physical, they feel like they don't have a belonging anymore. And that's really important, that they still have so much to give in the sense of love, compassion, gratitude, kindness, and just being themselves. Their personalities alone would be a sense of belonging, knowing that that's accepted.
So Thomas Joyner's theory, the interpersonal theory of suicide, says if these circles interconnect, my thwarted sense of belonging. I believe I'm a burden. And there's another major circle that has to be part of this to increase that risk notably. I have to have the capability, which may not mean I have a gun or a rope or a knife or pills or a bridge or whatever a measure or method of suicide might be. Capability comes from inside. Do I have the internal capability to kill myself? Me living as a fire service professional for many, many years, I've seen a lot of death, and that increases the capability in first responders, the exposure to death. Seeing somebody around me take their life by suicide might give me capability. Having low regard for life just because of my core beliefs, which Ange will talk a bit more about core beliefs in a bit, might give me capability. And these things combined together, my perceived burdensomeness, thwarted sense of belonging, and capability can increase my risk when we see that those circles interconnected.
So when they interconnect, we need to know that if my core belief system, and we will talk more about it, but if my core belief system aligns with I might join that person in the afterlife, that's a dangerous line to cross in our core belief system. That person who loves us so much, if they have died by suicide, gives us even a higher risk. Knowing that, we need to check in our core beliefs, which we'll talk about further in a couple of minutes.
So there's groups that are at higher risk. You talk about where core beliefs are and the groups that sometimes have core beliefs that might prevent them from being at risk, but it also might endanger them to be at higher risk for suicide. Indigenous, Métis, Inuit, and First Nations groups are at higher risk. Those who are bereaved by suicide. Those in justice and child welfare settings, or individuals who engage in non-suicidal self-injury, known as NSSIs. Those who have attempted suicide.
And those who live with medical conditions. We know in Saskatchewan, one of the highest rates of suicide is people living with chronic pain. If you know somebody who's living in chronic pain, check in on them often, because that chronic pain will lead to thoughts of wanting to be out of pain. Individuals with mental health disorders or substance use also increases the risk, because if I'm using a substance, my inhibitions and my desire to live may decrease simply because I'm using a substance.
And that's not the end of the list, folks. There's so many more in the list that are at higher risk. Lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender populations. Members of the armed forces and veterans are at higher risk. Those with chronic, as Ange mentioned, medical conditions. She talked about pain, but chronic medical conditions. Those recently released from a mental health facility. In fact, there's an elevated risk for those who are released from a mental health facility for 6 months to a year, because a lot of people who are released after being under the care of a mental health facility, they have a support network in the facility. They go out back to their life and things aren't as supportive as they were in the facility. People aren't coming to visit them. Everybody thinks, oh, Jim's fixed now. But the fact is, I'm at a higher risk.
And simply at a higher risk, simply because that oftentimes, because we're a crisis-oriented society, we tend to get all on board when someone is at risk. They get into an institution, and then after that, everyone's kind of like, okay, oh, that was really a lot. That was a crisis. Now I'm going to take a step back. That's when we need to take a step forward more often than not. And that's that gap we'll mention later. People who have recently begun antidepressants. Now there's something going on in the brain when people who have just begun antidepressants. What happens in the brain when we just begin antidepressants, when we've been clinically depressed and we go to our doctor or we have a virtual visit with our doctor, is my energy levels increase, but my thinking hasn't changed. So what needs to happen is both the antidepressants and seeking appropriate professional support need to combine each other so that the medicine that our brain needs, it has enough time to catch up with our thoughts.
Some say it takes about 6 weeks on onboarding a new antidepressant medication to get over that higher energy phase and actually have the thoughts start straightening out because the serotonin is being uptaken more appropriately. So in the last category is men in midlife and older men, and we'll talk about both of those a bit along the way. But it's not this simple. We hope we're not making it sound simple, that those are the groups at risk. This is the interpersonal theory. You need to just simply ask and look at the plan and plan for safety. No, it's not that simple. It's complex. The Canadian Air Force actually recognizes suicidality as multidimensional. It's a phenomenon. It involves all these levels of the human condition. including economic and other factors, which we're really embroiled in right now. And suicidality is frequently the result of the intersection of a number of these risk factors. And risk factors amplify each other. It's not just one risk factor that is going to take over. They all amplify. And because we're in a pandemic right now, we've recently heard pandemics come riddled with fear, anxiety, grief, and chaos. And that, Ange, puts people at higher risk. Look at some of the things that people are dealing with right now.
Well, we are all dealing with uncertainties on one level or another. We're all dealing with isolation on one level or another. Prohibition. We feel prohibited from doing our daily life because we are prohibited.
Mm-hmm.
So knowing that increases the monotony, increases our hopelessness, it increases confusion or relationship conflicts or shifts, finances, and job loss. We are never more posited for that pandemic to affect us negatively than now.
Yeah, it's like the perfect storm in so many ways. And those things are all very real to people. And an economic crisis typically leads people to greater depressive symptoms and anxiety symptoms, which we know that brings up the risk for suicide. This coming economic crisis might not cause as many deaths as the COVID-19, but unemployment's up. Poverty and homelessness will also go up and cause that risk to surge. We're not saying suicides will be higher, but the risk is definitely higher. And we know from history, suicides tend to go up during periods of economic downturn. For instance, we see on the bottom, that rate rose to a record high of 21.9 per 100,000 people in 1932. That was the depth of the Great Depression.
Mm-hmm. So if we know all this, what can we do to combat it? What can we do to say, okay, I have all this knowledge, now I understand. How can I apply that understanding to be a little bit more resilient, to build my resilience through this and not have it depleted continually? Jim will talk a little bit about the brain and isolation after we talk about this.
Yeah.
That there are some things we can do. And these are strategies that we've worked with people who have said, you know what, this strategy worked for me and it helped me get to the next phase in my life. It was small, it was micro, but it worked.
And I love being isolated with you. So come a touch closer so we can get you from out behind those boxes. Right. Thanks. So it works like this because we've seen it through many people who've interacted with. What happens is a person does this. They go through distress, crisis, turmoil, and they often get not self-reflective, but they withdraw into self. And they don't really have a purpose. And not that you have to have this glorious purpose, the theme for your whole life, the philosophical thing. Everyone has a purpose. Like there's platitudes about purpose out there, but is it possible when we're in isolation, let's pick that alone, that I can have a purpose? Is my purpose to go through a box of pictures today? Is my purpose to paint a shelf? You know, here's one purpose we got from somebody. They said, you know, today I just cleaned out my pencil jar on my desk and that was my purpose that day. And that helped me just kind of make it to the next moment. So individuals need a purpose. We all need a purpose, and that'll help reduce suicidal ideation and mental health conditions all through. The purpose doesn't have to be great. When we're done our session today, our purpose, my purpose is going to be to go sit down and eat a bag of chips. And I am honestly going to be, it's almost like if we've heard of gratitude meditation and empathy meditation, we're starting to embark on purpose meditation, taking that pause. Things aren't going well. Maybe the kids are screaming. My purpose right now is just to take 3 deep breaths. We identify the purpose in the second that we're in it. And what that does, it's like a micro goal where it starts to build your neural processing so that now you can start to define your purpose moment by moment and eventually find yourself understanding what your purpose is holistically as well. So purpose is the first one. So these people that go through this, they find their purpose, and then they find their what, Ange?
And then they find their identity. My identity is no longer connected to my job. A lot of people feel a loss of status because their jobs no longer exist, or they can't go to work and they don't get that happy feeling of like, oh, I did a good day's work. All of those things have kind of been lost for a lot of people. And recognizing that, my identity has to have a little bit of a shift now. Am I a human being who's helping the world, who's helping save lives? It's not tangible for me. So knowing that my identity as a human being who cares about other human beings, whatever it is, whatever my sense of belonging is to me is to others, how I perceive my identity. Getting a little bit deeper, if I know that my identity is I'm a good person, I'm doing my best here, I'm having lousy days, lousy moments, but my identity as a good person means I'm going to take 3 breaths. What's my purpose right now? Maybe not yelling at my spouse, maybe not identifying with the negative parts that I know exist in me. Maybe my whole identity right now is just to be a good person to my dog, to my kids, to whoever's around me, to my neighbors, dropping off a note, making sure they're okay, standing on the sidewalk, waving. Those seem like very trite things, but those are part of my identity because I'm a kind and genuine and good person. And if you are, as we believe you are, then just really hanging on to that and saying, okay, that is my identity. So I'm going to work on that.
A lot of our identities took a kick in the butt, though, when we had to go home and not be at the office or the site or the plant or wherever it is, because we have to work from home. And many times we gain part of our identity from the work we do, not just the work we do, but where we do it. So knowing that's a shift in identity, can we reclaim a piece of our identity? Because I'm also a handy guy who can fix a faucet. That's part of my identity. Maybe I can do that. So establishing some purpose in the second, reclaiming a piece of our identity, leads us on to the next thing. As we pick our way through any crisis that we're involved in, can we have compassion? So this is huge. We are all pretty easily found to give compassion to other people outside of us. But how much compassion do we give to self? This is so essential that we bestow the gift of compassion upon self when we do something stupid or feel that negative day, half a day or 2 days or a week, or we just can't get out of our sweats. Just say to yourself, you know what? This stuff we're going through is unprecedented, and I'm going through it along with everyone else. I'm just going to have compassion on myself. When we give self-compassion, we're able to then offer genuine compassion to others. And that has a really cathartic, soothing, neurochemical bath on our entire being that says, okay, you know what? You're okay. You still love yourself and you're still worthy of love. Compassion, self-compassion, purpose, identity, compassion. And as we're picking our way through a crisis to make ourselves resilient and come out ahead, what's the last thing we need to have, Ange?
We need to have knowledge. So knowledge just isn't some sort of ethereal thing. Knowledge is actually real. I know that something exists. Can I use that knowledge and get myself some understanding? What do I understand about myself now that I didn't understand before? Oh, I understand that, you know what, sometimes I just want to go downstairs and swear at the cement. Like, that's okay. Sometimes I feel like punching a wall because I'm tired of being at home and I want to see my kids and I miss people that I love. So knowing, taking that purpose, identity, compassion, and using that knowledge and combining it. So I have knowledge, I have understanding, it gives me wisdom. So the application of that knowledge and understanding gives me wisdom to say, you know what, I want to come out of this wiser. I want to come out of it stronger, and I want to come out of it with a little bit more self-reliance than I had before, because I used to rely on externals. Now I have to rely on internals. It's a huge shift for a lot of us. So if I can rely on my own wisdom, putting knowledge and understanding together, I think everyone wants to be known as a wise person.
Oh yeah. So what do you know? Like, what if we could ask questions about what we know right now? This can come through that same moment we're breathing through. What's my purpose in that second? To just straighten out my pencil jar on my desk. That's my purpose. But then my knowledge is this. Okay, I know that my pencil jar is cleaner. I know something now. Knowledge brings certainty, as Ange said, and having certainty in anything. My knowledge about COVID-19 is I may not have it right now. My knowledge is if I were to contract it, that I'm going to understand some of the symptoms earlier to get the support and help I need from the medical staff in my region. Knowledge is so important. Knowing that I'm not going to know if my job or my business is going to be up and running when this is all through. So I can't claim knowledge in that. But what I do know is that I'm not in this alone either. That also helps us as we pick our way through a crisis. So anytime, and we found people who use this quite regularly, where they're going through a journey that's really challenging, They identify their purpose in the second, in the moment, in the day. They secure themselves with some of their identity by saying, this is who I am. They have some self-compassion, and they don't worry about compassion for others in the moment when we're due with some self-compassion. And then they have some knowledge of what's real to them in this moment as well.
And just a little a side note on compassion. I'm going to take this from one of my mentors, Dr. Homark, here in Saskatoon. He said, if you don't have compassion for yourself, you won't have it for others. And it was really hard. So it was hard for me to do that because I wasn't raised to believe in thinking about myself. I wasn't raised to think, oh, you don't talk about yourself. You do things that are modest. That was my upbringing. So he said, take yourself and put yourself in the position of a clinical, right? If you can set aside our judgments about ourselves and say, okay, can I look at myself as if I was another person? Does that person deserve compassion? That's how much we deserve it. And moving from there, I was a more compassionate person to everyone in my world.
Thanks, Ange. That's really helpful. So thank you for looking at how to pick your way through this crisis with us. We're going to move on here. We've talked about many things. We'll look at the warning signs and risk factors. It's easy, but there's a lot of them. What's the difference between a risk factor and a warning sign? We're going to find out here as we go forward.
So do we know the warning signs of suicide? Well, we know several of them, and one of them is a sudden change.
Yeah, and we're going to see that in a behavioral realm as well. We'll look at the warning signs related to what people talk about, what their behaviors are, and what their moods are. Here's a warning sign list about what people are talking about. If people are talking about killing themselves or feeling hopeless, if they're talking about having no reason to live, or being a burden to others, or feeling trapped, or having unbearable pain. These are the things people who are suicidal talk about, but are we listening to them? And sometimes we've been able to see people who mask it. This life is shitty, I don't got any reason to stick around anymore. And they turn it into a bit of a joke in some sense. Mm-hmm. But are they really feeling legitimate feelings of not wanting to be around anymore?
Asking someone, are you legitimate about that? Because I personally don't joke about suicide, and I don't want to put that on you if you are joking about it. But I need to know, are you serious? And then often people will say, oh no, I'm not serious. That was just a joke. And then we move forward. But oftentimes people will mask it, and it shows up in their behaviors though. So when we look at behaviors, for instance, it could signal risk. And if it's related to a painful event, loss or change, we're looking at increased use of alcohol and drugs, looking for a way to end their lives, such as searching for online methods. Isolating from family, well, that one is hard right now because we're all having to do that. And so that's not really a warning sign of behavior that we can really indict anybody with or place in their pool. But sleeping too much or too little, that one's not really a behavior we can actually see right now. Visiting or calling people to say goodbye, that one's a big one. Giving away prized possessions. I recently gave away something I liked, but I did it because I really wanted to bless somebody. I really love my future daughter-in-law. So I wanted to give her something. That was something I loved, but I knew that she would have more happiness in it than I would. That was explained. Aggression and fatigue are also behavior signs. Now, aggression can happen when we're in isolation because we are trapped in some sense. We're
going to talk a bit further about isolation when we go through our hope portion, but we want you to know this. When we are isolated, when humans are chronically isolated, they develop a neuropeptide. It's called tachykinin, and what it does is it enhances aggression and depression symptoms. It also enhances symptoms related to PTSD. And forced isolation is one thing. It's not just a couple days, it's a couple weeks and beyond that people need to be isolated. This is also why people are sleeping more and sleeping less, because there's so many neurochemical imbalances that are going on from not having the dopaminergic responses from interacting with people out in the real world. We recently heard from somebody, the one thing that people are the most addicted to is people. So we're missing out on that. We're missing, I tell you, I'm privileged to go and work in the fire hall and see the guys because I don't have that risk of being completely isolated like some of you out there are. And then those of you who go to the grocery store, even though you feel like that kind of suspicious eye is looking, are you going to cough on me and give me COVID? People are still enjoying their trips to the grocery store because they get to see people. So the tachykinin that's generated during isolation, it's actually changing our brain and causing aggression. Another thing that occurs, we find, we'll see this as we come out of isolation, is people who have development of tachykinin, this neuropeptide that brings these negative responses. When there's a threat, they don't recover from it as easy once they've come out of isolation. So the threat escalation process of stress hormones stays higher longer, as opposed to a person who's had regular exposure to social interactions.
Which is why it's so important that we actually pay attention to our moods as well.
Mm.
So knowing that we've had mood changes, I mean, who hasn't had a mood change during COVID-19? That's just the reality. People who are considering suicide, though, often display one or more of the following moods: depression, anxiety, loss of interest, irritability, humiliation or shame, agitation, anger, or sudden improvement or relief. Sudden improvement and relief is very, very important, because it does, if someone is living with depression and you hear them time and time again, you hear the tone of voice, and they are living with depression, you know it, and they've been perhaps diagnosed with it. If all of a sudden their mood changes and it's lighter and they're happy and you almost feel a relief for them, that's actually a dangerous sign, a warning sign to us to say, should I have that conversation with them? If your gut says, should I? Go ahead and do it, because the result of you having that conversation with them is going to either boost your immune system or lower it by not having that conversation.
And that's a great thing to remember. We see the pattern shifting for somebody. It could look like it's a positive shift too, which is a kind of a scary thing, Ange, when you think, oh, Jim's out of his funk now. All of a sudden, I have a solution to my problem. My problem is my emotional pain and suffering, or the failure of my business, or the loss of my stocks, or the relationship in a shambles. Okay, and when I decide I want to kill myself, my mood shifts because I've now put a plan in place and I'm solving a problem, making the world better for everyone, believing myself to be gone. But a quick note though, what would be a way to ask somebody when you see their pattern shift? Are you good at that, folks? Does everybody here in our chat today, in our visit today, do you have the artful communication style that you want to actually ask people about this when you notice the people you care about, their pattern shift? What's a way we can do that? Let's just, Angellah, I'll just throw a couple options out for you before we move on.
So just simply asking someone, so what's the cause of your sudden mood shift? Or what's the cause of your happiness right now? Or what, can I ask what's happened? What's changed for you that you feel so much better right now? And if the answer is, I did my will and I feel better about dying now because I have a legal will, that's probably a warning sign, and take that seriously.
Yeah, so if you get a sense somebody's pattern shift and you don't want to feel like you're scrutinizing them or got them under the microscope, a nice way to say it is to say, hey, Jim, I know we've been buddies for a long time, and I've really appreciated you when you're happy and even when you're less happy, but I've noticed a shift lately in both of those. You seem quite a bit more happier now than you did a couple weeks ago. Is there something going on that you can talk to me about? And simply use the way you communicate and refine it. But the one thing with that is go in with a script. We can't just go in cold unless you're a master at wordsmithing.
Yeah, and unless you are a licensed professional, then for sure, do what you've been trained to do. But permission-based questions are the best. Asking the person, can I ask you a question that you might take the wrong way? And I want to make sure that I'm accurate in what I'm hearing, especially because I can't see your face sometimes, or unless we're Zooming, we can't see our faces. Just asking permission to have that conversation really reduces our stress hormones while having that conversation.
And you may have the relationship with that person that they say no, and you can say, I'm asking anyways, and just go for it. Sometimes, as well, as artful as we want to be in our words and our vernacular, sometimes it's just as good a thing to say, hey, Jim, are you thinking of killing yourself? And get it out there right now.
And making sure that you are that trusted person. Is there something that you don't trust about me that perhaps you wouldn't answer, that you would ask someone else? Well, yeah, I would trust so-and-so with this conversation, but not you, because maybe I've hurt them in the past, or maybe we have hurt them in the past. Building back trust is something we can do right now, and saying, you know what, this is really serious and I want to have a conversation. I want to be a trusted person in your life.
So we've looked at talking about suicide, behaviors related to suicidal ideation and mood. Those were the warning signs. There's risk factors that play into those, and they actually, when we combine the two together, we can see a person's at a higher risk. We need to watch for risk factors of suicide. And what are they? Well, there's health factors. We're not going to belabor these ones. We'll look at them quickly. The mental health conditions. We know, we've talked about, any mental health condition can increase my risk for suicide. Serious physical health conditions and traumatic brain injury. Under environmental factors.
Well, if I have access to lethal arms, including firearms or drugs or prolonged stress, which will be happening for people, stressful life events, exposure to another person's suicide, or graphic or sensationalized accounts of suicide, which is why the media does not report suicides anymore, because they don't want to give that kind of attention to suicide.
Yeah, sensationalizing it will often induce people or incite people to think in more romantic terms about it, and that's not a nice plan. So our next category in risk factors is historical factors. Folks, it's just so real. If a person's got previous suicide attempts, if you or I have a family history of suicide, or if you've or I have been exposed to childhood abuse, being the victim of childhood abuse, neglect, or trauma, these will all be really significant markers to elevate somebody's risk for suicide. So can we ask somebody about those things? Are we allowed to?
I think we are allowed to at this point, and I think we need to at this point. If there has been trauma in a person's life, and it's usually happened in the developmental ages of their upbringing, and they haven't been treated for it, they could have PTSD. They could have post-traumatic stress syndrome. They could have something that is lending their thoughts to thinking about suicide. But we know that 75% of all suicides occur in men. Males, whether they're teenagers or adult males, we know that 75% of them are male. Why is that statistic so important to know?
Well, we need to know that statistic because men are known classically for not communicating, for keeping their feelings inside, for not sharing their distress or stress or even pain. Even when a dude falls and smacks his knee on the ground, he gets up and shakes it off, and first thing does, looks around to see if anybody saw, because we don't want to admit we're in pain. But emotional pain is as real. And until we can be brave enough as humans, first of all, like, you have that certificate, let's use it. You're a human. So go ahead and share your concerns or emotions or the feelings of self. This is going to happen when we can stop, back up, walk things back, and take a breath. Okay, you know what? I do feel anxious about what's going to happen with my business. I do feel a bit anxious. And then talk to somebody who you care about, who cares about you. That can be a good support for you, because as Ange said, the suicide rate of all suicides, 75% are male. Although females attempt suicide more frequently than males, males die by suicide more frequently than females. So Ange, why do females attempt suicide more? What's the thinking on that?
Women will think about suicide more often, and they will attempt more often, but oftentimes socialization will hold a woman back, a female back in particular, because they're caregivers, essentially. Socialization has taught them that's not right to do, or that's not, you're worse as a person than if a male dies by suicide. So society's judgment on females, especially if they have children, will cause them to rethink. They will attempt more. They're just as much at risk, if not more. And women are diagnosed with mental illness far often more than men. And that is a bias that the World Health Organization has given us as a commission to health instructors by Canada. They have said that there is a complete bias when it comes to giving women diagnoses of mental illness more than men, simply because society still sees males as the breadwinners, or males as more important to the family's survival than females. Whereas we know that men die by suicide more often. Men will think in terms of, well, if I kill myself, I know that their mother will take care of them. If I kill myself, I know that the aunties or the uncles, people will step in. Whereas females don't tend to think that way. We're socialized to think, who will take care of the kids?
And in the epidemiology of suicide, It's also learned that males will try to kill themselves or want to die because of failures more frequently than females will want to kill themselves or die because of relationship issues or emotional issues. And I was almost smirking when you were talking about the bias, Ange, and I'm sorry about that, because it was just reminding me of a study I read that I found incredulous. It was a study where a female and a male, there was many of them, went into doctor's offices with the same symptoms, mental health symptoms.
Exact same symptoms. Exact same age and exact same socioeconomic status.
Yeah, and about 80% more regularity, the females were diagnosed with depression than the males were. It's an amazing bias, and I don't know how to remedy it except talking about mental health in ways that are going to give us all some insights. Mm-hmm. So keeping those elements in mind are pretty important as we look at those suicide risk factors. So warning signs and risk factors, they're different. And we just did a good conversation about the difference between men and women, but I want to pause here and talk about one more element. The fact, and we mentioned it, that men don't communicate enough. I tell you this, when men get to be my age, well, yeah, 40 and beyond, and I'm far beyond 40, they start to lose testosterone in about 1% per year.
What's happening to women at this time?
Well, women are starting to gain testosterone and lose estrogen. Mm-hmm. So, estrogen, we can't forget that when men are losing testosterone, they're gaining estrogen, which is typically known to be a female hormone. And it also helps with our emotionality. But here is the rub, folks. When I was raised as a little boy to, come on, shake it off, Jimmy, you're okay. You know, you only fell off the fourth rung of that slide. You're fine, buddy. Wipe it off. No, don't cry. You don't want to see your buddies crying. Come on, you're tougher than that. Be a man. You never saw a mom or dad reach down to their little girl who fell and say, come on, shake it off, sweetie. You can take a punch. It just doesn't happen. We've been socialized as males to not enjoy our emotional profiling. Remember that, our emotional profile. Remember that human certificate we got when we were both born? Mm-hmm. We both were born with humans with the same emotions, but being socialized to kind of subvert them or squash them or overshadow them has now made it to this point. If I can't have emotional competency now, I'm starting to feel all these things, anxiety, stressors, worried about my wife, my kids, my dog, my job. And if I can't communicate them, those things are going to cause mental illness, distorted thinking, and give me a higher risk for suicide. And the lethality with which men choose to do suicide is significantly different than the lethality with which women do. So that's why more men are dying by suicide than women.
And that's not to say that women haven't been raised to be strong, independent females or feminists or whatever you want to call it. They are as well. So it depends upon how we've been developed, how we see the world, our core belief systems. It depends upon a lot of things as to why women attempt more often. And when women do die by suicide, they've usually tried to reach out one or two times at the very least.
And I've been working on self for a few years and just very accepting of all my emotions as I start to show them. But watching a million little things, I find I cry about 2 or 3 times every episode now. And I still feel like, I don't know if I want her to see me crying. Is it okay?
Yeah, it's okay to be human. And I think we need to be more human now than we've ever been before. In just allowing people to see the truth of ourselves and allow our loved ones to see the truth of what we're going through.
And then when you engage them, asking them questions about their mental health and wellness or suicide, they're going to be able to respond to you in a way that says, hey, I know you're a caring, supportive human individual.
And those things that happen when we do have those conversations, when we have positive, emotional conversations with our loved ones, with people, with friends, people that we care about, guess what happens to our brains? Our brains release trust hormones. Those are good things for us right now, especially during this time. If trust hormones can be released in our brain just from having a good emotional conversation and allowing people to be human, we're going to be more strong. We're going to be more resilient against the things to come that we don't know about.
Yeah, you can't buy those trust hormones. You got to get them from interacting in trusting ways with people that you care about and that care about you. Sometimes it's hard to be vulnerable, but I tell you the benefit is tenfold on the other side.
And the thing about power of vulnerability is if that person's kind of a, what do we want to call that person? There's a name for that person. A curmudgeon.
Son
about
of a bitch.
Our if that person's not being positive when we do and when we are vulnerable, that's on them, because you did the braver thing of being vulnerable.
And guess what? Because you made that step to be vulnerable, even though they curmudgeoned their way away from sharing real vulnerable emotions, when they do have a crack in their armor, they may realize, hey, that's the person I can trust to talk to. So you've left an opportunity there for the future, because we can't fix anybody by wanting to give them the right answers. They have to be desiring to have that interaction with us.
So let's go to the resources for suicide.
All right, we're going to take a quick look at that, resources for suicide, folks. This is not hard at all. As I mentioned, this is going to be quick. You know what? There's so many resources available in your own region, wherever you are. In fact, 2 years ago, one of the highest Google terms was suicide. And it's not all about people trying to find ways to kill themselves. It was about finding resources and understanding suicide in better ways. So right here in Canada, crisisservicescanada.ca has an excellent website where you can phone in, you can get on the website chat, you can go in a text version and just text them right away. And you know what's going on with this? I mean, in many ways, I'm thankful for what we've learned here in the last month and a half, because so much money and thought and energy has gone into mental health and these very resources. Now, when you text that line, you're likely going to get a real person on the other end right away, not an autoresponder.
Mm-hmm. And sharing that information is really important, because what we've learned in just our work, we're CISM trained, so that's critical incident stress management, CISM trained. We're part of the provincial team here in Saskatchewan. When we have encountered people who have tried to die by suicide, who have attempted suicide, getting a number of people all in the same text stream, all in the same messenger stream to say, okay, we're going to name the group, we're going to do this. And so if that person's not available, someone else is available, because you're all getting the same text stream, so that someone is there for that person, whether it's all of you or if it's one. It really has proven to be quite successful for people to feel supported. And we need to feel supported. Our brains need to feel supported. Our emotions need to feel supported, because we're humans going through really tough stuff.
And these resources are there for you to reach out to or to share with somebody. Support lines are ubiquitous now, and that's great. Let's use them, let's call them. And here's a nice option with these support lines. If I have a friend who's suicidal and I don't know what to do, I can call one of these and they'll give me some insights. Well, Jim, check if this person's imminent for suicide, you need to call 911. And otherwise, they'll maybe give you some tips or how to move through this journey with that individual. We have a Hope for Wellness line for First Nations, Indigenous, Métis, and Inuit friends down there. And this is a strong representation that says, let's give people the support that's right for them when they need support. And the lines do work when people are vulnerable and honest going through them.
So take a picture of that line, send this to someone that you know, and just share that information and be part of that support team that you can be.
So those are the support lines, ladies and gentlemen, and we're not going to leave you without hope here. When we start to culminate all the risk factors and signs and symptoms and what's going on with COVID-19 and the distress that everybody's feeling societally and it's globally, even though we're in this together, we sometimes feel like we're alone, and that's okay. Remember the pick? How are you going to pick your way through this? What's your purpose? What's your identity? Do you have some self-compassion, compassion for self? Okay, when you feel like you're all alone in this, say, I feel like I'm all alone in this, and talk to somebody about it. And then the last one is knowledge. Then once you've talked to somebody, guess what? That's your first introduction to knowledge. It's talking to someone lets you know you're not alone. There's someone. So we need to move that forward and talk about hope, which is it's huge, the value of hope, Ange, isn't it?
Yeah, the value of hope could never be more important than right now. And so we know that social isolation and loneliness can kill.
Yeah,
we know that.
It's if we're separated from loved ones, there's a loss of freedom, as we mentioned, uncertainty over the disease status right now. We're starting to get lulled into kind of a bit of a sleep, because we've heard the same themes for the last 2.5 weeks. Pardon me?
Same rhetoric.
Same rhetoric in the last few weeks. But now boredom sets in. That's bad for our brain, and on occasion creates traumatic effects, which we talked about tachypnea. And we know suicide has been reported and substantial anger generated and lawsuits brought following the imposition of quarantine in previous outbreaks. People get really cranky from being isolated. what can we offer people? If you're a people, I'm a people. We have our membership card as humans.
We can offer them hope. But we need to understand where hope comes from, and are there different levels of hope? There are 2 levels of hope. We all know the first level. The first level is, I really hope the show that I love tonight is on, because I've decided that not having a job, I'm going to be my own personal movie critic.
Yeah, I hope they start Ray Donovan again.
Yeah. So
I hope for a car, a lotto win. I hope they find a cure.
if it's not on tonight, I'll watch something else. Those are first levels of hope. A lot of people, and many of you included, have lost a lot of first levels of hope, that I'll have a roof over my head, that my rent won't be raised, that my landlord won't kick me out, that I'll have a job to go back to. Those are things that are basic to humanity, and we need to have hope in those. But when those first levels have had so many hits to them, we need to have and find where our second level of hope is. And what's the second level?
Well, there's a common theme among studies of second level hope. It's a connectedness that we have to our developmental past and to our future and to our present. And it occurs, this second level, through relationship with others. It's not about externals that provide us hope, like winning the lottery or Ray Donovan starting again. It's about that internal pieces that I have that developed my ability to have a second level of hope, particularly when those first levels of hope get chipped away at or knocked down. And
the second level of hope is so important because it is developed in the past. It's lived in our present with a future orientation. We need to know just how strong our relationships are right now. So can we phone our friends up that we haven't seen because we've been too busy and say, hey, I know I've been busy, but now I actually have time and I'm really sorry. See where that sustained strength is, because that sustained strength of hope, that second level of hope, will sustain us through this entire crisis, because it has a sense of belonging. It has an identity. I identify with my friends. I can relate to them. I have shared rituals, shared humor with them, all of those things, shared experiences with them. That sustains and strengthens that second level of hope, is which all of us are surviving on right now.
And part of that second level of hope are core beliefs. We have to really dive into what our core beliefs are for a few moments. We're not going to rush our last portion here. We want to share with you some information that might be helpful to you. We're going to understand that core beliefs can sometimes come into conflict with each other, but sometimes we don't even know what our core beliefs are. Here's a list of core beliefs. If you were to pick 5 out that represented you, it would be easy to do if you just went with your gut. But sometimes loyalty and justice might be a core belief, and they might come into conflict as well.
Sometimes humor and honesty they conflict with each other. So knowing what our core beliefs are, they're basic beliefs about ourselves, others, and the world we live in. They're the things that we hold on to be absolute truths deep down. Essentially, a core belief determines how we perceive and interpret the world. When something happens, our mind opens the basement of our core beliefs that's most likely to keep us safe and defend against threats. So they're very convincing, they're full of persuasion and conviction, and it's something that we accept as true without question. Perhaps we haven't questioned our core beliefs as much as we need to right now, because they have a huge influence on our sense of belonging and the basic picture of how we are viewed and treated by others. And it connects with meaning. So our core beliefs are so important that we need to know that they are connected with meaning. How does that happen? Well, it happens, it's so important to life. Meaning is so important to life. It is susceptible to change. When the first levels of hope are forced or needed to change, adaptation requires us to pivot or to change or to alter as best we can, not in a maladaptive way where now I come out of it with more bad habits or perhaps harm to myself, but we need to pivot in the sense that how can I adapt and come out of this a little bit more resilient than I thought I was even resilient before?
What a great question. And if you're finding your core beliefs, many of us need to do work on understanding our own core beliefs. And one of the ways we were taught to understand them is to have somebody film you for a week and then you go back and review the tape and see what you did, how you behaved. Okay, and that core belief, the core beliefs will percolate to the top of that video footage. And if for instance, right now, my core belief is stability, one of them, and determination is another of them. My determination to get through this crisis might override the fact that my stability is in falter mode right now because everything is unstable in some sense right now. So when those come in conflict, can I find more meaning in when can my determination bring more meaning to my purpose, as we talked about picking our way through this crisis? Mm-hmm. The core beliefs are such a big part of hope. That second level of hope, folks, it's if we include understanding our core beliefs, we can endure any setbacks or failures of those first level of hopes. And first level hopes, it might seem massive, but are pauses in our vocation or career or life. That's a first. We all hope to get the job we want. We all hope to have a steady income. Those are the first levels of hope. Will our second level sustain us? It's part of the essence of being who we are. And it doesn't depend on what?
Well, it doesn't depend on what happens to us or what we can do. But sometimes just knowing what our core beliefs are, that's that part of that pick. If I know what my core beliefs
Mm-hmm.
are, and if one of them is really being affected right now, like optimism, well, what other core beliefs can I rely on right now? What other core beliefs can be sustained through this? Because I can't give up optimism, really, but it is really taking a lot of hits. So can I accept that? Can I see that's real? I accept it. I'm going to give myself some compassion and rely on those other core beliefs that are just as important.
Right. So looking at how to pick our way through that one, if I'm being negative right now, my purpose is just to kvetch about a couple of these stupid things. Maybe that's my purpose in the second. I've identified a purpose. Just identifying a purpose is a micro goal that's going to bring you success. My identity is, okay, I'm an optimist. I'm going to bring that in. And then I'm going to give myself compassion. Okay, my identity is as an optimist. And my compassion is, okay, right now I'm not being very optimistic. Don't beat myself up about it. It's just real for now. It doesn't define me in any way.
And neither will the chocolate you eat tonight define you.
No, you are not going to believe how much chocolate I'm going to eat tonight to try to define myself. The knowledge, so then the knowledge of knowing that, knowledge of knowing how I deal with this is not defining me. That's a piece of knowledge that lets us realize as we pick our way through this process that I have some control.
Yeah, and knowledge extends to family members too. So do I know that my family is not judging me for not being a total optimist right now? Does my family judge me? Do they accept me? Are they genuine? Are they empathic? Are they supportive in my moment right now? Because I'll move through it faster knowing I'm supported by the acceptance, genuineness, empathy.
Well, let's talk about moving faster through some stuff from when support occurs. And it comes with a bit of a story about this little guy.
Yeah.
This is a mouse that's in a forced swim test. I'll just move over this way so we can be beside this. This is a mouse that's in a forced swim test. Curtis Richter and many have done research on mice and rats in labs. And their job was to determine how long these little guys are going to sustain themselves in the forced swim test. They'd swim around and around the beaker, and eventually they'd realize there's no exit here. I'm hopeless, I can't get out. They dive down and die looking for that final exit. And these poor critters are used all the time in labs in this way. But what happened at one point was one of Richter's lab assistants reached in and pulled the mouse out. Now, maybe you know this, maybe you don't. There was two groups of mice, domestic and wild. One of them group would swim on average about 39 seconds, dive down and die. The other group would swim an average of about 1:16 and dive down and die. A lot of people think, what, Ange? Which is the group that swam the longest?
Well, I answered the wild ones because they've had to survive harder, longer, tougher circumstances.
Yes, so they're survivors. You'd think automatically, and I agree. That's what I first thought too, is that the wild mice were the ones that survived because they survived, they swam the longest. But if we ask the question in a different way, which group of mice had interaction with humans for support? And it was the domestic mice that swam longer. But then when they scooped one out of there, that lab assistant, I could almost hear the little mouse take a big mouse breath. And Richter said, come on, we're doing research, put the mouse back in. And they did, and they were flabbergasted. Can we still use that word, flabbergasted, in 2020? So. They were flabbergasted that the mouse swam for 3 hours. They did it with other mice, 6 hours, a day and a half, both wild and domestic mice. And so what they realized was this, that they've removed hopelessness, even for that second. After elimination of hopelessness, Richter said, they do not die. And is it possible that after the elimination of hopelessness, when we interact with humans in a meaningful way in this COVID crisis and suicide risk factors are starting to get on the rise, is it possible that we can provide some hope for another human being?
I think we need to provide hope for ourselves. We've had many calls in the last number of weeks asking us to do this segment. And giving hope to people is one of the biggest dopamine hits I've ever had in my life. And so if you can give hope to someone and say, hey, we're all in this huge experiment that the universe has given us, and can we be that person that picks somebody up and just says, let's have some hope together. No more platitudes or anything, just really being real and saying, let's have hope together. Let's find something to have hope together with, together.
Yeah, taking care of one another. Why not do it now? We have a pause on so much of life. Now's the time to do it. That'll prevent people from wanting to kill themselves. You'll be able to identify the suicide risk factors and warning signs in the people you're interacting with. If there's one thing we can always yearn for and sometimes attain, it's human love and connection. And this will bring hope. It does.
It does bring hope, and you can be part of that. And so we just encourage you to share any information that you find valuable in this segment, and just share it with whoever you like, and bring hope back.
So thank you so much for taking your time today to sit in with us and talking about suicide and COVID-19. We know this is not an easy topic. So what we like to ask our groups to do after they've gone through a difficult topic is go do some self-care. What did we learn about self-care, Anne? Self-care is not?
It is not a democracy. Self-care to Jim is going and fixing something in the garage. Self-care to me is Netflix.
Yeah,
no judgment.
If I can drill some screws in the wall, I feel better. I don't know what I'm going to fix up, but I'm going to do it. So self-care is not a democracy. There's zero judgment for what you do for self. And we just hope that you're getting some of the love you deserve and need, and you're able to share that kindness and love with the people that are along your way as well.
Mm-hmm.